Welcome to One on One. I'm Lidar Greve-Lazi, and I'll be your host for this new series where we sit down with passionate voices shaping the conversation around identity, courage, and the future of Israel. These are stories that will inspire you, challenge assumptions, and spark new perspectives. For our very first episode, we're honored to introduce a woman whose journey defies expectations and whose voice refuses to be silenced. Raised in Syria and Lebanon, Rawan Osman grew up believing the worst about Israel. But her path led her to France, to freedom of thought, and ultimately to a new identity. Today, she's a proud Zionist and a bold voice against extremism and complacency. Rawan's story isn't just personal, it's a challenge to everything we think we know. Welcome to One on One with Rawan Osman. Rawan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start to hear a little bit about your personal story. You grew up in Syria, you grew up in Lebanon. What was the turning point for you? The moment where you realized or first began to question the narrative that you'd been taught your whole life?
So to be clear, I grew up in Lebanon. The first 18 years of my life, I was raised in the Bekaa Valley, and I attended a French Catholic school, although my father is Sunni from Damascus and my mom is Shiite from the Bekaa Valley. And it's important to mention that my mother is the daughter of the Lebanese Civil War. This is why religion was irrelevant in my upbringing. After the atrocities the Lebanese committed against one another, there is a generation that wanted to distance itself from sectarianism, from the differences imposed by religiosity, etc. I grew up visiting Damascus several times per year. And although my upbringing was among tolerant, liberal, democratic people, the only thing everybody hated is Israel and the Jews and the Zionists. And I always explain when I go for public speaking around the world, but also in Israel, that it was really easy to hate the Israelis and the Jews. Because during my upbringing, during my childhood, Israel occupied South Lebanon. Nobody told us that Israel occupied South Lebanon because they needed a buffer zone after Arafat and his gang and their supporters from the left side of the political spectrum from around the globe abused the Lebanese territory to send terrorists to attack Israeli civilians. After more than 10 years of restraint, eventually Israel opted for a military action to occupy the south, by which they created a buffer zone. And also, we did not interact with Jews. The world seems to forget, especially in the West, that more than 800,000 Jews were uprooted from the Arab world. So they weren't present around us to challenge whatever the state wanted us to believe. And back in my days, we had 3 TV channels. So it doesn't matter on which side of the political spectrum you came. Everybody, what do I mean by everybody? Your parents and your family members, the famous people you see on TV, the intelligent ones who write in the newspaper, they all told a consistent story about the Zionist entity, the neighbors in the south, the assailants, etc. So growing up that way, unfortunately, I was, during my teenage, one of Hezbollah's biggest fans, until I woke up. So you ask about the turning point, and I told this story hundreds of times already. It was a coincidence. When I wanted to study in Europe, the natural destination was France, because I spoke French coming from Lebanon. And I landed in Strasbourg in the Jewish quarter, near one of the biggest synagogues in Europe. And I did not think that the Jewish quarter had any Jews, because the Jewish quarter where I worked in my early 20s in Damascus had no Jews. The Jewish quarter in Beirut had no Jews. So I was surprised that this neighborhood in Strasbourg was filled with Jews. And upon the first encounter, I had a panic attack. But that incident shook me to my core and led me to ask for the first time, why? Because I was sharing the same space in a grocery store with a Jew, the enemy. Why was the Jew the enemy? And that started my journey in discovering how intensively brainwashed and lied to we were.
An incredible story of, I guess, just chance, as you put it. And you know, you mentioned that all of your surroundings, your family, everyone around you in Lebanon and Syria had the same view. So how did your family, how did your parents take it when you came home one day and said, you know, I've changed and I have a new worldview now?
It did not happen overnight. After spending a year in France, where I had access to uncensored information, unlike the case of many Lebanese and Syrians, that was before the days of social media. Having access to information, I could read the history of our region. And it was a long process for me to understand, hold on a second, what do you mean we like Hezbollah when the former Secretary General, who did not die of old age, Hassan Nasrallah, said upon the foundation of Hezbollah that they do not acknowledge political borders, that their goal is to make Lebanon an extension of the Islamic Republic in Iran. It was really easy to realize, obviously, I do not subscribe to this agenda. So when I returned, infuriated, outraged to the Middle East, I tried to share naturally with my family members, my close friends, to tell them, look, I made a discovery. Of course, it was not a discovery. Hezbollah published their manifesto in the newspaper. People knew, but they were doped or bored, or they chose to submit, to comply, and slowly Hezbollah grew to the point where in the past few years we saw that they are more powerful than the state in Lebanon. But people were not interested. It's a lot of work. The history of our region is very, very complex. So where do you start? With which story? With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, that the concept of the nation state is a modern one, that Lebanon is not much older than Israel, that Jordan is a very interesting part that was carved of the British Mandate of Palestine. There's a lot to unpack, that the Jews did not come from Eastern Europe, as we learned in history class back when I was 12 in Lebanon. People were not interested. It is much easier to comply, to accept that hundreds of millions believe that Israel is an occupying aggressor state. Leave it at that. And standing with the Palestinian makes you look good, because if the Palestinian is the underdog, then as a moral person, you have to stand against them. Plus, the law in many Arab countries forbid people-to-people contact between their countries, for example, in Lebanon or Kuwait or Algeria or Iraq. They forbid the contact between their citizens and Israelis, even if you met Israelis abroad, even if you were on a holiday in India, in Australia, in Canada, you're not allowed to speak to them, because it's very important to dehumanize the Jew/Zionist/Israeli. So people were not interested. And it took a very long time for me to publicly speak and declare that I stand with Israel.
And you know, there are misconceptions not just in the Arab world about Israel, but also in the West about, let's call it, radical Islamist ideology. I mean, you've been very vocal about Islamist extremism and its impact in not just in the Middle East, but also in Europe, in France, and throughout the world. What are the most sort of dangerous misconceptions you think the West holds about this radical ideology?
that it's benign. They underestimate the danger. They think that it is condescending to say that we don't want you to transform our culture. Why not? If they come to Denmark or to Germany or anywhere in the UK or in France and they say, I know that I have to send my children to this public school because of my residency or because of where I live, but I won't until you remove pork from the menu. Or I know that I'm a citizen who obtained the German citizenship or British, whatever, but I will not send my 7-year-old to the swimming class. The West is too tolerant. And this sounds like a silly statement. I've watched Europe transform in the past 15 years. I've lived in France, I lived in Cyprus, and I lived in Germany. And the more or the higher the expectation of Islamists is, the lower the expectation or the lower the standards of the EU are getting. And this is dangerous because it's reshaping the culture. You see it when you listen to the rap songs. You see it when you see how the European teenagers themselves behave, even if they're not a generation of those who emigrated, immigrants or refugees, even if they're not at all connected with immigrants or refugees. The culture is changing, the attitude is changing, the expectation, the relationship with the state is changing. Islamists are exploiting the weaknesses of Western democracies. And this we have seen mostly during this encampment movement. We have seen that they demand representation because they say we are equal human beings. I would like, or in my culture, it's acceptable to demand of your wife and daughters, for example, to wear the veil, and in some cases also the niqab. It's acceptable in my culture. And as we are equal human beings, then I have the same rights you do, then I call the shots in my home. And what I'm proposing to many Europeans is the following. Human beings are indeed equal. We have equal rights, but we also have equal responsibilities. Human beings are equal, but cultures are not. If cultures were equal, why do hundreds of millions aspire to relocate to the West? They very much loathe and seek to destroy. We hear public statements aiming to bring the system down from within. And watching this, I can only say to the Westerners, you undermine, you underestimate how efficient Islamists can be in bringing the system down from within. When you grant them citizenship, you offer them political power. So, for example, after October 7th, my country, Germany, was very supportive of Israel. They understood why Israel had to wage a war against Hamas. But after a year or so, when it was the time for elections, politicians mellowed down, changed their attitude because they realized that on the streets there is a movement that is vocal, angry, and supportive of Hamas, or at least conflating Hamas with the civilians in Gaza. Many of them caved. This is what I mean by you grant them political power, and by that you give them access to reshaping your culture, and in some cases, to bring the system down from within. You have a fifth column that exploits welfare, that works against you, that loathes your values, and that operates in a parallel manner. So I read the other day how many courts in England operate or adopt Sharia law, and that is tolerated, permitted or neglected. And that is dangerous. I do not understand who thought that it's a good idea to ignore it, to keep shoving the problem under the carpet. It's going to explode in everybody's face.
And some people say that it's too late, that Europe is essentially doomed. I mean, what do you think about that?
I believe people say that, especially if they live in Europe, because of the statistics. If in Denmark, for example, the average birth rate per family, per couple is 1.5, compared to 6 or 5.5 in other parts of Europe. If you see the growth in Muslim communities compared to the growth in European societies, especially in Western Europe, this can come across as alarming, especially when you see demonstrations, protests calling for an Islamic caliphate. So in Amsterdam or in Hamburg in northern Germany, when they shout out loud without being intimidated by the presence of police, that they want to bring a caliphate in those countries, that maybe scares a European, as you can imagine, especially if they do not really understand the Islamic culture.
So you speak out publicly on all of these issues. Do you feel safe speaking out, especially given the sentiment that we're seeing now on the streets of Europe, the United States, and around the world? And also, you know, what type of reactions have you been getting, and are there any that sort of stuck with you?
Look, I have never been vocal or as vocal before October 7th. After October 7th, have you heard this term, accidental activist? I'm one of them. I became a public figure without planning on doing so. Out of outrage, out of shame and anger, I volunteered to translate the videos which were filmed and shared by Hamas. And as a mother and a woman, I did not care, or I did not have a plan. I just spoke out, sometimes at the beginning without a light, without a mic, without training, without any understanding of how to use social media. But I knew that social media is very powerful, effective. It is my own platform for free. I don't need anybody's permission. I'm gonna speak my mind and say no. Until here, Siyamnu, this is the red line. And as you mentioned, I have never imagined how rampant anti-Semitism all over the world was. I thought it's the case in the Arab world. And that was shocking. I can't say that I'm scared. At the beginning, I was receiving a lot of death threats. But again, those who want to kill you will not notify you ahead of time. It was meant to intimidate me, and I'm not the only one who receives death threats. They gave up, again, because if they want to kill you, they're not going to tell you. So I did have to implement measures for my personal safety. But I spend a lot of time in Israel, and here I feel very safe. If I'm doing public speaking, especially on hostile territory, on some universities in the US and Canada and some European campuses, then I have security and I have bodyguards. But this doesn't make me hesitate. We need to speak up, and we need to inspire the younger generations to speak up against jihadism, terrorism, call it whatever you like. In Europe, they've paid a high price. In America, they all remember 9/11. Nobody has a solution or a strategy on how to contain or eradicate this problem. And Israel was hit on October 7th, and many who saw the magnitude of that event, whether they're Jews or not, decided to speak up, even in the Arab world, although they're not numerous because it is a dangerous position to adopt in public. But people are speaking up because, and this was my thought on October 7th, if they dared if Hamas, but in my mind, if jihadists dared do this to Israelis, knowing that the USA has Israel's back, what can they do to their enemies in Lebanon or in Syria or in Iraq? This should be alarming to the entire world. And yet, in an interesting plot twist, we've witnessed a very, very short sympathy expressed towards the Israelis. And even before Israel reacted, the world turned around and they started denying actions Hamas bragged about. They started justifying what Hamas themselves could not justify. That is just to help us see the amount of hatred, anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, and ignorance. And we witnessed the birth of a freak, the child of the strange marriage between the far left and Islamism.
You know, you have become a very prominent, as you mentioned, accidental activist, speaking out against extremism, but also you've become a very strong and loud supporter of Israel. So I want to ask, what does Israel mean to you personally?
Since October 7th, I visited 11 times. I knew that my heart is in this country. I have a strange connection even before I came, because I was exposed to the culture through the friends and the colleagues I had in the past years. But nothing compares to actually coming here and to watching how people interact with one another, knowing that the country is bleeding, that the healing process will not start until the hostages are back, all of them. Every time I come, my bond with Israel becomes stronger. And that is not to say that I'm blind to the problems in Israel. There's a lot of room for improvement, but I see a lot of potential, tremendous potential in the people and in the country. To me, Israel is a miracle. And I always give this example to teenagers who are skeptical, who roll their eyes. And I ask them if they try to start a book club, any tiny project. Now think that the Jewish state became a country in spite of the Holocaust. Imagine you were a Jew in 1945, sitting in a concentration or death camp. If I told you you're going to survive and you're going to live to see the birth of a Jewish state, you'd think I'm hallucinating. Yet the Jews pulled it through, knowing how badly the Jews can argue. They pulled it through. It is amazing. And it's a beacon of light in our region. It's a pioneering, innovative country in spite of the non-stop stress, the non-stop suspense. To put it mildly, it's an understatement. No other country could have survived all this. And not only they survived, they thrived. And until today, although many Israelis disagree, and I watch this rift growing in Israeli society with a lot of sadness and a lot of fear, because I watch the news in the Arab world and I tell my Israeli friends, you have no idea. You're scrutinized, you're under the microscope, and every bad statement against any Israeli is celebrated. Still, I think that Israel will prevail, B'ezrat Hashem, because I see the potential and the culture, and that the most annoying Israelis, no matter how badly they criticize you, they will take a bullet for you.
And so I have to ask, are you optimistic about the future not only of Israel, but of the region, of perhaps an expansion of the Abraham Accords with Lebanon, with Syria? I mean, what is your view of the future?
I'm very optimistic, but I'm also realistic. I do public speaking in Israel, and I made sure to tell the Israelis since October 7th, listen to me. This is not going to be a short war. This is meant to be the final war. Hamas truly thought they kick-started a process that will lead to the demise of Israel. But they miscalculated because they do not know how resilient the Israelis are. This will not end soon, and it will get worse, much worse, until it gets better once and for all. If you don't want to send your children and grandchildren to fight as you are now, you have to be patient and ensure Hamas, not physically, but that this ideology is obliterated. And we are seeing it expand in the region, and I also told them that. You cannot get rid of Hamas only. Hezbollah is a perfect example of a problem the world, the region, even Israel, shoved under the carpet for so long until it became so massive, it can no longer be ignored, and it exploded in our faces. But Israel dealt with it. Now we have this interesting turn of events in Syria, and I still think that Lebanon and Syria will join the Abraham Accords. Now, we have many hiccups on the way, but it was necessary. Nothing else was going to remove Assad. Nothing else would have disrupted or cut off the supply chain between Iran and Hezbollah. You needed to reshuffle the cards in Syria. The situation is very critical, volatile, and a lot of people are suffering. So the price is very high, but I truly believe there are enough partners on the ground, even underground, who will help us pull this through and transform the region, even if that requires redrawing the map of the Middle East.
Rawan, thank you so much for joining us today. You know, your story reminds us that courage and curiosity can break through the deepest of indoctrinations, and that Israel's future is about people, values, and a willingness to take a stand, even when it's inconvenient, when it's dangerous, and that the future still remains bright. Rawan Osman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.